Welcome back then, members. We'll go straight on to agenda item 7.
Thank you, Chair. So, as with previous meetings, this report relates to the redrafting of a chapter in the plan, in this case, Chapter 6, which relates to basically the allocations at the Principal Centre of Exmouth and the main centres, local centres and service villages. The intention here really is just to get members' views on the current drafting of that chapter. Which has progressed, obviously, off the back of the allocations and discussions that we've had, and hopefully the wording addresses the discussions that have been had about the allocations and where members have said things like this needs to come forward in a comprehensive way with adjoining land. We've tried to integrate that into the policy, for example, to make sure it reflects members' wishes. Welcoming feedback on the drafting of those policies, which will go into the Reg 19 version of the plan, which you will see again on December 11th as a next iteration. So there's potential to incorporate changes until then. I suppose the other thing to mention in terms of the covering report is that we've provided this table at paragraph 2.4 to just summarise the position in terms of the housing numbers, because I think that was perhaps slightly unclear at the end of the allocations exactly where we got to in terms of numbers. So I think overall we're in a good place, but there is still this uncertainty in terms of Budlow 1, as you heard earlier, and Honey 18 in terms of whether or not those can be incorporated into the final Regulation 19 version of the plan. So that's where we are, really. Welcome views on the redrafted Chapter 6.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. So in view of time and also our limited attendance and various other factors, what I'm going to suggest we do here is pick up any kind of major issues in this chapter, and then if there's anything specific that's to do with individual site allocation policies, I'm conscious lots of sort of relatively specific points have been raised separately. I imagine members will have some of those as well. I'm going to suggest that we do delegated authority for Ed in consultation with myself and Mike to agree those changes, and we can sort that out by email rather than going through each one here today, just for the sake of expediency, given that the principle of all of those site allocations has already been decided and we can't revisit. So if members are happy with that, I will go for, are there any major issues that people feel ought to be discussed now? First, I'm going to look at Peter. No? You happy? But okay, no, that's fine. Paula.
Thank you. It's just an access issue. It seems over the course of the week, we had one agenda sent, and then this agenda. This is relating to Broadcliffe 25, not 25 strategic policy. Broadcliffe is under number 25. It's to do with Broadcliffe 29 allocation. At the beginning of the week, there was a vehicle access route that you had stuck in this document, which we absolutely did not want to happen. That has gone, but in the wording that has left, it says this site is allocated for 24 new homes with a new access point where Green Tree Lane meets Town End. Vehicle and pedestrian access routes will need to be provided to link into allocated land at Broadcliffe 12. The last bit is absolutely fine, but we do not want a vehicular access onto Green Tree Lane.
So I'm going to stop you there, and I suspect you probably finished anyway, because that's exactly the sort of thing that we think can be picked up by email, because that's a relatively minor wording change.
But it's a huge point, and I just wanted to make sure.
I appreciate it's of significance. I think the issue is there's going to be lots of that kind of issue where the change is eminently sensible, but going through them here would take us a long time. Ed's giving me a side eye look now.
Well, I'm just concerned, Chair, that I think the point that Councillor Fernley is raising is actually a bit more fundamental than wording, because I think from the correspondence I've seen, the suggestion is that Broadcliffe 29 would be accessed through Broadcliffe 12 rather than have its own independent access off the junction with Green Tree Lane and Town End, but that would leave Broadcliffe 29 with no vehicular access of its own and therefore open to Ransom strips and things. My understanding was the intention was, it might be helpful if Mr. Dickens could bring up a plan of the site, but my understanding was the intention, and I stand to be corrected if I've misunderstood the intention, but the intention was to have a route, a vehicular route that ran through from the town end through to, is it the Wimpole Road?
Yeah.
At the rear of the site, and that by doing that it would ease concerns about vehicles on the town end side by being able to access it from both sides, but
You
not
seem to
that
have
we
gone
left.
quiet, Ed,
Broad-
or my ears aren't working properly. Can
Sorry.
you take it just a bit closer?
My understanding was that the intention of the committee was that both Broadcliss 12 and Broadcliss 29 had vehicular access, but that they were developed together so that there was a through route between the two sites that linked through. The
Well-
danger of leaving Broadcliss 29 with no vehicular access of its own, other than access through Broadcliss 12, is that we end up with a ransom situation being created, which I think we should avoid. And if I recall, I don't think there was any concerns or objections from the Highway Authority in terms of access to Broadcliss 29. In fact, I think we showed a junction arrangement that the developer had come up with that sort of built access into that lane by a new junction between Green Tree Lane and Town End as
And
well.
that was the junction that was in here a week ago, but is not in here now. So I assumed it had been taken out for good reason, because when I spoke to you at committee about this, when we spoke about this at the last committee, you said to me, it's indicative, it doesn't have to happen. And because that route is proposed to be a safe walking and cycling route, we desperately don't want any more vehicles to it. I mean, if you're going to have access to it as well as between 10 and, 12A and 12B, and then you put a road through it to Green Tree Lane, then you're going to have all sorts of cars wanting to cut through rather than go the long way round. So it seems absolutely bananas to do it.
Well, it's over to committee. That was my understanding. If I've misunderstood, then I stand corrected, and we can change it. But you do run the risk of Broadcliss 29 being held to ransom by Broadcliss 12 if it doesn't have the opportunity for its own vehicular access.
I
So
think
I think that's the danger.
Isn't that ignoring the possibility that they could just put in a planning application with an access off whatever the lane is called, regardless of what policy says?
Well, that's part of my point. Is I suspect they would, and without an objection from the Highway Authority, I don't see that we'd be able to resist that. So I thought the allocation was trying to plan this in a holistic way that created a through route through. Whether that needs to be controlled in some way, I don't know. But I thought that was the intention of the committee.
If I remember right, I think committee's intention was definitely that they were connected by vehicular access. My impression coming into this was that that would be the only access then to the both of them. That was certainly what I thought we'd agreed. Thinking back, I think we maybe left that ambiguous unintentionally. And therefore maybe there's a decision to be made.
Well, yes, I think there is, which is why I say I think this is a more significant issue. I think we therefore would need a steer from members as to whether or not it's the intention for Broadcliss 29 to have the opportunity of access off Green Tree Lane / Town End, or whether access is vehicular access is only through BRCL 12, in which case we need to state that in the policy.
Because we wouldn't have, I don't think Angie would have said that they would want any more of Broadcliss 12B allocated if this was to be the situation. The situation was to allocate 12A and 12B was so that access could be got in without needing access onto the single track of Town End Lane and Green Tree Lane.
On that point, I also didn't think we allocated all of Broadcliss 12.
Not all of it. The intention was to allocate the a strip that enabled an access onto. It's not called the Wimpole Road, is it? But I keep referring to it as the Wimpole Road. Is
I
it?
think it is actually.
Okay. That came through onto Wimpole Road with frontage development either side, but the sort of northeastern part of the kind of lurid pink colour on the screen was not to be allocated, and I thought that's what we'd shown actually in the previous report on the settlement boundaries, was because the remainder of that, then the northern part is land for mitigation, coming back to the discussion earlier. So I wasn't necessarily intending that was within the boundary. I would need to check back.
The boundary goes through the middle of 12B, I think. But you started off by allocating 43 houses, and then when 12B came in, then you took it up to 100 houses, which seemed, when you said 138 was far too many. I know the village is not happy with 100, but there we go.
So the boundary in the previous report for the settlement boundary does cut through that area. I don't know if Mr. Dickens can find it. And then the text in chapter 6 for Broadcliffe 12 says, built form shall be focused in the land to the northwest of Winter Gardens and south of Lake Farm, with lower density development forming a frontage onto the road from Burrows Cross within the field to the northwest of Winter Gardens. So that, yeah. So the area outside, in effect, is mitigation that is land that wouldn't need development, but is providing mitigation for that development. And then you've got the land within the settlement boundary, which is the built form of the development, and even then the wording of the policy says that's focused in the southern parts.
So two things then. One, I'm going to move as a general point of principle, picking up on this issue of the mitigation areas, that they need to be separately identified on the allocation maps, because what we don't want is people either deliberately misinterpreting or accidentally misinterpreting the allocations to include the whole area. So I'm going to move that from the chair as a recommendation. Well, I've done it. I think that reflects the discussion that we had earlier. Before we deal with the remainder of Broadcliffe 12, do folks want to debate that? Councillor Ingham?
Just have I misunderstood you? But because surely we should be putting the boundary up to and including the allocated site that's proposed for open uses. That's what we said, and then we define it by other policies. Is that not what we said?
No, I think what we'd said earlier was that the allocated boundaries should include areas that are not necessarily built form, but are providing necessary mitigation that would need planning permission. So like with the sports pitch, we use the example because it's a change of use of land and there's some works needed to develop the sports pitch, that should be within the settlement boundary. But where it's just land that's going to provide their biodiversity net gain, for example, or perhaps a surface water attenuation pond or something like that, that would be outside, was my understanding of where we got to.
I think possibly the confusion is coming from the overlapping discussion between the policy on the settlement boundaries and the allocation boundaries. I think that's possibly why we're getting into some confusion. All I'm saying is the areas that are identified for mitigation, for green infrastructure, whatever, ought to be shown in a, if you can go back to the obnoxiously pink map, please, Matt. All I'm saying is the areas that are for that mitigation ought to be shown in a different colour for absolute clarity about where the houses are going and where the other bits are going. So picking up on the example in Wimpole, which I'm going to keep banging on about, at the moment the housing allocation washes over the orchard, which is not what the text says, and you know the text could be slightly more robust, but the image shows housing in the orchard, and I know if somebody puts that in front of my community, everybody will immediately be very unhappy, because there'll be a misunderstanding that that area has been allocated for housing rather than community orchards. So my proposal is that the areas that we're keeping for green infrastructure, for mitigation, all of that are just shown, identified separately in the plans. That's all I'm proposing as a general point of principle. Are folks happy we go to a vote on that? Okay, all those in favour of that proposal, please. That's carried. Coming back to the Broadclist issue then, sorry for that slight interlude. Are you saying, Ed, that we need to make a decision about whether 12 only has an access through, sorry, 29 only has an access through 12 in policy or not?
Yes, because currently the drafting shows us saying there would be an access point where Green Tree Lane meets Town End for Broadclist 29, and it sounds like we're saying that isn't what you wanted.
Okay, so Paula agrees that that's not what she wanted. Councillor Jess Bailey.
My recollection when we discussed that was that the entrance was not going to be from, is it Town Lane, Town End Lane? That's my recollection.
I actually agree. I think our intention was not to access through Town Lane, whatever we're calling it these days. But at the same time, I'm sat here trying to work out what good a policy would do when you get a highways engineer report saying it's absolutely fine. Added to the fact, I am slightly concerned about the possibility of 29 being blocked as development site because we are forcing it one way. And that actually could have serious impact on us, our ability to deliver this plan as a whole. And as such, I'm probably against forcing the issue at this time.
That's a fair point. It might not help with the 5-year housing land supply. Does anybody else want to speak for the first time on this issue? Councillor Ringham.
I still don't get the logic of making it more difficult to travel to Broadclist. Have I misunderstood that?
I think Paula's point is that there's absolutely no problem with a pedestrian and a cycle link through to Town End on the west side, but that she and the parish council would prefer there's no vehicular access from 29 onto Town End on the west side.
I anticipate there'll be a challenge through that, in that they say, why? Why would that be any different from anywhere else? It does seem an odd one.
The parish knows both the landowners. Is it not possible to have a chat with them before we actually make a proper decision, one we can't go back on, to see whether there is an agreement?
Through you, Chair, I mean, what we've tried to do is word the policies in such a way that we will get access into Broadclist 29 from Broadclist 12. So the second sentence of the allocation of Broadclist 12 says vehicle access to the site will need to be from Wimpole Road with vehicle and pedestrian access through into allocated land at Broadclist 29. So, but if you remove the opportunity for Broadclist 29 to have its own vehicular access, then it can only come forward after Broadclist 12 has come forward. And then you've got the issue of, do you allow Broadclist 29 to access onto Green Tree Lane and Town End? I'm struggling to see why we would. I understand the views of the community, but in the absence of a highways objection from the Highway Authority, I think it's difficult to justify that. And also, if we get a planning application with access through that way, and there's no objection from the Highway Authority, how are we going to resist it anyway? My thinking was that you'd have access at both ends, but you'd be reducing the pressure at the Town End lane by virtue of the access off Wimpole Road automatically, because there's two ways of coming in and out. So you'd split the movements rather than funneling it all through that one access point.
I'm not convinced, and my memory may be wrong, that actually highways had said anything about Broadcliffe 29. I have a feeling that that hadn't been looked at.
So Mr. Freeman's going to check that. I think fundamentally there's a decision of principle rather than necessarily whether highways have said anything or not. Councillor Jess Bailey, save me from my indecision.
No, I was just going to ask, so can I just clarify? So we've got the built-up area, the settlement boundary on that right-hand map. Are we saying, therefore, that that's going to be changed to make it even bigger to accommodate the purple, but the extra bit's going to be clearly delineated as mitigation, so it can't then be developed as well?
You have not saved me from my indecision. I have some sympathy with the parish council's point that you're at risk of worsening the vehicular situation here. Equally, planning application could just come forward with a vehicular access on it anyway, and I think we'd probably struggle. Then again, do we want to be making policy that's running scared of what highways may or may not say in the future? And then there's the 5-year housing land supply issue where Broadcliffe 29 could probably come forward relatively quickly, whereas Broadcliffe 12 you'd expect as a larger site to take significantly longer.
It's already come forward.
What has? Sorry.
Broadcliffe 12 is already got a pre-app.
Okay. Pre-app. Yeah, okay. Yes, you're right. Yes, I'd forgotten about that. Sorry. I mean, either way, I think that the point stands. A larger site takes longer to come forward and doesn't necessarily help our land supply in that respect. So I have sympathy with both sides of the argument. And I might just do a mic and abstain. Mr. Freeman.
So as has been said, Chair, there is a pre-application inquiry on the site, which you saw when we were going through on the 1st of November with the wash-up sites, and you also saw the proposed access into 29, which I showed for illustrative purposes, but was the site promoters' proposed arrangements to address the fact that, so Highways had said that they acknowledged that the road was constrained. They didn't object, but they said that mitigation would be required to address it. And that plan that I showed at the 1st of November was the site promoter's proposal for addressing that. And that's sort of where the conversation had got to in terms of that. But there was nothing to suggest from County Highways that an acceptable access couldn't be achieved with mitigation and careful design.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman, I think.
Really?
Does somebody want to make a proposal? And we'll see what happens.
Yeah, go on, I'll make a proposal.
Councillor Howe.
I will make a proposal to kick it off, and I'll actually go with officer's recommendation on this as it stands, accepting your colouring differences of which side of the boundary you're on as well. Yeah, I know. But nevertheless, leaving the possibility of an entrance on 29 because we've got no highways objection onto Town Lane, or whatever we're calling it these days. It's not Town Lane, is it? It's Green Tree, yeah, Green Tree Lane. Regretfully, but because we've got no highways objection, I'm struggling with it.
Okay. Planning Committee, Councillor Howe, has made a recommendation. Do we have a seconder for that? Councillor Ingham? Okay. So we have a proposal. Councillor Jess Bailey.
I won't be supporting that because I think just because Highways haven't put in a formal objection, I don't think, I don't always agree with Highways. So I think, and I'll be voting against that proposal because I think that we should only allocate Broadcliffe 12 and 29 on the basis that their access through Broadcliffe 12. I think it's an awful lot of houses. There's a lot of concern coming from Town End Lane, so I will not be supporting it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bailey. Councillor Howe has a question.
Mr. Freeman, 12 and 29. Can we force master planning for those two together? I was just thinking that. Good minds think alike.
You're all right.
I don't see any reason why not. I mean, the wording we've got at the moment has tried to ride a fine line of getting them to work together without going as far as a master plan, but we could take it a step further. If you wanted to make it a sort of joint allocation of the two, subject to a master plan that then seeks to resolve access arrangements to the site as a whole, and therefore not nail our colours to the mast until we've perhaps got more information.
In that case, Chair, I'll change my proposal, if I could, to asking for that.
So just so we're clear, the amended proposal, which is still seconded by Councillor Ingham, is to alter the allocations here so that they come forward as one master plan with access arrangements to be determined. Was that what you wanted,
yeah.
Mike? Councillor Bailey?
Yeah, I'll put that, provided we say we noting the concerns about access onto.
Can we note concerns in the policy?
Not really, Chair. I mean, we could put something in explanatory text to say there are community concerns about the access that will need to be addressed through the master plan process. Would be the best I could suggest. It's not something you wouldn't express concerns about something in the allocation itself.
Okay. So we have a proposal that's been made and seconded. Paula looks like slightly unhappy, but not overly unhappy. So I'm going to take that as a good sign, and we'll go to a vote on that one. All in favour, please, of the proposal. That's unanimous. Okay. So that's Broadcliffe dealt with.
Chairman, can I?
Are there any other fundamental issues? I did come out to public speaking at the start.
I didn't realise quite what was being discussed. It's about Strawberry Lane and pedestrian access.
Right. Okay. Briefly.
It's just there's talk about there's access for GHED 27, but there's no. I mean, it only works for that site. It certainly doesn't work for the lower site, and to my mind, it doesn't really work for either of them anyway. So it's potentially possible to improve access along Strawberry Lane, and there's no conversations being made with the town council as far as I know, and that's one of the landowners along that lane. So that's where I would like to see improved pedestrian access. If those two sites are to be developed, I want to see pedestrian access along Strawberry Lane.
So you'd like the policy to have a requirement for a pavement along Strawberry Lane? Mr. Freeman?
Well, from memory, I think that there's parts of Strawberry Lane that are wide enough to accommodate a footpath, but not where you head east into the town. It narrows to the extent that I don't know that would be possible. I think the way that it's drafted at the moment, and so I don't have the text in front of me, was to seek to gain pedestrian access into the town by going north through the existing developments and then onto the Exeter Road, is it? And then east into the town from there through the existing network of footpaths. And I think that is the most deliverable way of achieving safe pedestrian and cycle access to those sites. I don't think, from memory, there was anything in the comments from the Highway Authority that suggested that they would be promoting creating footpaths alongside Strawberry Lane. And as I say, I'm pretty sure it narrows to an extent to the east that it just wouldn't be possible. But there would need to be some form of crossing north-south across it in order to achieve what the policy sets out to.
Can I come back just
Briefly.
all the way along there? As far as I'm aware, all the landowners are at least open to negotiation. So it's not a case that you have to do it on the road. There's Cricket Club are actually been felling trees and have been talking about it. The town council owns the next piece, and there's a email put in by the landowner right down at the very end, the east end of Strawberry Lane, almost awaiting negotiation or being approached, and they haven't been. So there is an opportunity. Thank you, Chair.
Let me just check the wording that we've got as to how prescriptive we've been about how a safe pedestrian and cycle access is attained, because it may leave it open for that option. I'm just trying to find the wording. Bear with me a sec. You see, I don't think it's that prescriptive about how it's achieved. Ottery 10 says this allocation must be supported by details of special measures to be taken to protect ancient trees and measures to ensure that safe cycle and pedestrian access to nearby facilities in Ottery St Mary Town Centre can be achieved. So they could go either way in terms of how that's achieved. Land south of Strawberry Lane, GHED 27 says need to provide measures to ensure that safe cycle and pedestrian access to nearby facilities. It's the same wording. So it does leave it open for them to pursue a route that involves footpaths along Strawberry Lane as an alternative. But I think it would be in their hands to propose how they deliver that safe access. But there are those two options. They could explore the Strawberry Lane route, or they could seek to link up with existing footpaths to the north.
I think what I'm hearing is that this is probably too much detail, possibly too much detail for the plan.
Yes, I mean, I was just checking, but I think the wording leaves it open for them to pursue either option, and it would be for them to make proposals through the planning application process about how they deliver safe and pedestrian access. The main issue from a allocation perspective is that we are ensuring that they deliver that safe pedestrian and cycle access.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Are there any further comments on this specific issue, or can we move on? Councillor Howe.
It was actually a comment I was going to make to Councillor Faithful. If the town council favours such a route, it would be ideal for them to act as the negotiator and talk to the developer and push and help, particularly if they own part of that land as well. Probably not so much for our planning department, but definitely the town council could be a leading light in gaining what they prefer.
Indeed. Councillor Jess Bailey.
As we've got the map up there, and this applies to Tipton Village as well, I think it's really important with our colouring, because that 09 is shown as housing, and it's not all housing, and on Tipton it's shown as 04 is shown as housing. So I think we need to be really careful with our colouring.
Yes, happy to take away an action to check that we've got our colouring out right, and we've kept between the lines as well.
Clearly, Ed was never a geography student. Councillor Ingham.
Along similar lines, Chair, where we say a site is allocated, it's one thing to colour it in one colour, but to say, well, there's going to be mitigation, but we've coloured it in as housing, it is giving the wrong impression. So at the next stage, we have to have that right on all of them, which is going to take a while, but we've said we're going to do it, so we ought to do it straight away.
And that's why I made that resolution as the first one that we tackled, because I agree that's important, and I don't think Ed's going to disagree. Are you, Ed?
No, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it's caught up in that same issue, because with 09, it's obviously the school, the land for educational purposes, which is sort of mitigation. So that's why the mixed use we've tended to use for sites that are both housing and employment uses. We perhaps need another colour for ones which are where there's land for infrastructure and mitigation.
Okay. Thank you, members. With all that said, are there any other kind of fundamental issues that we need to discuss here for Chapter 6? Yeah. Councillor Hayward.
Thank you. If I may, SDO1 Axminster. Just 2 points to question, or one is a request actually to Ed and his team. Within that section of Axminster and its future development, you've outlined the allocations that have gone through, and each section has conditions, requests, things that are, tweaking within the master plan. If I could at this stage throw in that either under Axminster 289 or under GHED 80, if the planners could incorporate into their thought process for the future master planning some burial facilities, because as Axminster gets bigger, the town will need somewhere to bury people. So that's a request from an infrastructure point of view. Appreciate you have open space, employment land, retail. Infrastructure is just as important. So the section GHD 80 to the east and 28 and 9 to the south, if some thought could be given when we do our master planning as to where some additional burial facilities could be, that would be appreciated. And then within that report, given that we've just agreed those new settlement boundaries, the black line you'll see there to the east of the town, there's a reference within Prestalla Farm GHED 80, the second paragraph. Development must incorporate a site road that is of a standard and is appropriately located so it, through potential future extension. Now, is that extension of the road or extension of the development? Because essentially that really, you can't extend that much further because you've just constrained the settlement boundaries to exclude the two green sections to the north because they're challenging topography, and really that's open space provision as outlined on the plan there. So I'm not sure what that word extension relates to. Is it extension to the development or extension to the road? Because the north-south relief road, Urban Boulevard, call it what you will, has long been on the table. We've master planned it before, and obviously it's come and gone. But perhaps some clarity through you, Chair, if I can, of just what that phrase means. The first part is just a request, if that be considered in the round, because it is a critical piece of infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hayward. Mr. Freeman.
Taking the last point first, as it were, in terms of the relief road, my understanding is the intention was this is talking about future extension of the relief road, nothing else, but we can look at clarifying that in the wording because I can see it's not as clear as it could be, but the intention here was to try and safeguard the route of the relief road so that we deliver the sections that we can on the allocations that are coming forward in this plan, and if by some miracle we get whatever it was, £15 million of funding to deliver the rest of the relief road, we've at least kept that option open. In terms of burial space, I need to take that away and give some thought to that and what evidence is coming through work on the infrastructure delivery plan in terms of that, because there are going to be issues like that across the district, I suspect, in terms of burial spaces, but also in terms of other infrastructure requirements. And then there's the issue as to what we can reasonably require from a particular development. But I appreciate that's something that needs a land requirement somewhere. And we need to think that through alongside the infrastructure delivery plan. So I don't have a solution necessarily to that, but happy to take that away and give some thought to that and bring something back.
Councillor Ingham.
Chair, in the interests of completion for this item, please don't misunderstand my silence as meaning I agree with proceedings, as you'll see. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
To debate it further would be another 2-3 hours, and I'm not convinced.
Okay. Are there any other sort of major issues that we need to pick up here? No? Okay. In which case then I will move from the chair that we agree the draft chapter goes forward subject to any further issues being picked up by email with delegated authority to Mr. Freeman in consultation with the chair and vice chair to agree those changes. If we're happy with that, Mr. Hunter? Yep. Mr. Freeman?
Well, just one fault on that is obviously the final drafting of Chapter 6 will come to the committee again on December the 11th anyway. So actually all the delegated authority will mean in this instance is you'll see it as part of the draft agenda anyway, won't you? So I'm just thinking through actually that delegated authorities doesn't actually mean anything because it's going to come back on December the 11th anyway. So
I'm not sure I necessarily agree with
Okay.
that, because if there are changes to be picked up, then that we haven't discussed at committee before that regulation, I'm comfortable with my proposal that it comes back
I'm not
through discussion. Good. Okay. All those in favour of that proposal, please. Those against, and those abstaining. Okay. Thank you, members. Councillor Ingham.
To note, Patrice, regardless of our opinions, it's a great shame that such important decisions are taken by 6 of us.
Indeed.
And it's profound decisions we're taking.
Indeed. I don't think I can disagree. Okay, that brings us to, with 45 minutes of a quorum committee remaining, that brings us to agenda item 8 on local plan viability assessment. Mr. Freeman. Sorry, Councillor Hayward?
My apologies, slight intervention. I do have to leave in 15 minutes, so I hope you will still be core at that point, taking Councillor Ingham's point on board.
Paula also has to leave at 5:30, in which case then we have 15 minutes of quorum committee remaining, because quorum, I believe I'm right in saying, is 5? It's 5, okay, so we have 15 minutes remaining. Mr. Freeman, no pressure.
Any chance of getting through this in 15 minutes?
Well, we'll have to find out.
I'll be quick. So what you have before you is assessment of the viability of the plan, which you'll see from the papers has taken account of the policy requirements that have come through in previous discussions in terms of the plan, in terms of requirements, in terms of standards of build in relation to future home standard accessibility requirements. These are summarised in the graphic in paragraph 1.4. CILM 106 requirements, environmental costs of our biodiversity net gain requirements, etc. And really the bottom line is what affordable housing requirements sort of fall out of that. You'll see that this has been influenced by looking at the values across the area, the costs, as I've said, of constructing those dwellings, and therefore what's viable in terms of delivery of affordable housing requirements, which is set out in terms of the headlines at paragraph 2.1 in the report, which is the proposed is that we require 35% therefore, so where we've got allocations in the edge of Exeter, Sidmouth and Budleigh, the 35% requirement. In all other areas, it would be a 30% requirement, with the exception of Axminster, where it's 25% requirement because the lower viability in that location. But I would stress that 25% is still the current requirement in Axminster, and we've actually been doing rather well in terms of uplift through grants in Axminster. That means we've actually delivered at a higher level than 25% from developments coming forward, particularly the Cocoa Lawns development. Outside of allocations, it would be a 35% requirement. I know there's been some concern as to why that's 35% and not the 50% that's in the current local plan outside of settlement boundaries. I think the issue here, having gone back to our consultants, is partly a sort of complete lack of evidence in terms of sales data in those areas. So we've currently got 50% in Budleigh, Salterton and Sidmouth, but there's been virtually nothing coming forward in those areas in this plan period to have records in terms of what is viable in terms of sales values and things in those locations. And when we have had applications in those areas or outside of settlement boundaries in the countryside where it's 50%, we're always challenged on viability because it inevitably shows that it's not viable to deliver 50% affordable housing, and we end up at a lower level. So they're saying, based on the evidence that we've got, we can't justify a 50% requirement in those locations, and therefore the evidence suggests it should be 35%. And I think that's borne out in terms of if you look at planning decisions and where we've been challenged on viability and where we've ended up through application processes. I think that follows through and is logical. So I will stop there. That's the headlines. Happy to take any questions.
Just very briefly, could you come back on Councillor Fitzgerald's points from public speaking earlier?
Apologies, I thought that was the 50% issue.
Okay,
In
I
rural areas
don't
that
really remember what Charlotte said, the hazard of public
I'd
speaking.
written
being-
down 50% in rural areas removed. Why?
Okay.
So hopefully I've addressed that.
Is that the point that was... Aha. Thank you. So, yeah, so the other point was taking issue with all of the rural areas outside the identified places being grouped together and why that had happened. In the sense that you have value area 1, which is Budleigh Sidmouth, 2 on the edge of Exeter, and then value area 3 is Exmouth, Honiton, Ottery, and then you just have rural, which is everywhere else apart from Axminster, which is value area 5.
Well, I think the consultants have done that because the sort of values and viability profile is similar across those areas. That's where those groupings have come from. I appreciate that it's a large area that takes in a broad range of areas, but what they're saying is that the values and cost and viability profile is similar across all of those remaining areas. So that's why they've grouped them together.
So the rural blob exists because in statistical terms it is a blob.
I'm not sure about a blob, Chair, but they have a similar viability profile. Obviously, there'll be some variations within them, but they are sufficiently similar to group them together. It wouldn't make sense to break it down further than that in the assessment work.
They have been sensibly blobified, is my conclusion. Councillor Jess Bailey, then Councillor Ingham.
Thank you. I don't like the fact that it's only 35% for windfalls. I have been to a briefing on this, but I find it quite difficult to understand. But surely we've got higher percentage of affordables now, haven't we? Outside established built-up area boundaries, haven't we?
Yes, so this is the issue with the 50%, which currently applies outside of settlement boundaries at the moment. But what we're saying is that there's not sufficient evidence to justify maintaining that 50%, and the evidence we've got suggests that it's not viable to deliver that. And I think that's borne out in a lot. I mean, we're getting a number of windfall sites at the moment because we don't have an adequate housing land supply, but they're not coming forward at 50%. They're all arguing that that's not viable, and we're ending up around the 35% mark generally. So that's echoed, I think, in the decisions that we're seeing at the moment with windfall sites, both within and outside of settlement boundaries.
But don't we want to encourage development within our settlement boundaries, our spatial strategy, and discourage, if we're allowed to say that, outside our settlement boundaries? So isn't having a requirement having to produce a higher level of affordables, so less profitable, doesn't that go hand in hand with trying to encourage sustainable development?
I mean, I think once we get the plan through and adopted, we will need to have an adequate housing land supply such that we're not entertaining sites outside of settlement boundaries. The policy position will take priority and will only be granting consents within the settlement boundaries. So the issue becomes slightly moot at that point. It might become relevant again in the future if we don't have an adequate housing land supply. But as is the current situation, we're not getting our higher policy requirement because it's simply not viable. And then we end up having to say, well, the balance is such that we have to bolster our housing land supply position because we don't have an adequate supply, and therefore we have to set aside the fact that it's not delivering 50% affordable housing and take a view on a lower level in order to bolster our supply position. So I don't think in reality anything will change. because if we get into that position again and we end up having to grant sites that are outside of our policy requirement to bolster our supply position, we'd be getting 35% under the proposed policy here. We're getting about that at the moment. It's just the policy's 50%, but it's not viable, so we're not achieving it. So to my mind, it does make sense to lower it to what's actually a viable level.
Councillor Ingham?
Thank you, Chair. Where I think the argument's flawed is I understand that, and we have to grab the best we can with regard to affordable housing and what works. What I disagree with is that we're not embracing within that formula mixed tenure. So you can say, well, okay, it'll only be 25% affordable housing, but in addition to that, we're looking for 25% mixed tenure that fits in with community requirements. And the obsession with affordable housing, I understand, because it's a prerequisite, I believe, of why we're doing all this. I get that. But let's not miss the opportunity by including those other desirable types of dwellings that will help our communities become sustainable or stay sustainable if they already exist. And that's why I'm not in favour of what we're doing. It's tunnel vision, and we could be more flexible, I think, and make our communities more sustainable as they grow.
I think in response, it's difficult to be flexible in a policy because we have to set out the standard that we're expecting developments to achieve. Where there's flexibility is through the planning application process. If a developer comes in and says, I'm not going to deliver you 35%, I'll give you 25%, but they'll all be social rented and we'll meet this identified need in the community, then there's an opportunity through the planning application process for planning committee to say, well, when we're weighing up the material considerations here, we think there's benefit in that proposal and we'll accept that, even though it's departing from policy. I think if we started drafting policies on the basis of, well, if you do this, we might accept that, or we might accept that, it gets into very muddy waters, whereas the policies need to be clear. The other thing I'd say on that is if you look at the affordable housing policies that were in the housing chapter of the plan, we're already prioritising social rented housing on the basis that that's what there's a need for in terms of affordable housing and trying to achieve higher proportions of that. So that needs to be weighed into the mix in terms of the viability as well, because obviously the social rented is costing more to deliver than, say, affordable rented or shared ownership.
I have a lot of sympathy for what Jess and Ben have just said. I don't really like it. I think the evidence only says one thing, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. Any members that haven't spoken yet wish to speak?
Yeah,
go on then, Mike.
I'm actually going to follow on a similar vein, but in a slightly different track. And it's looking at the, crikey, whatever this graph is, which is hard to work out at the best of the times. We, as a committee, have said we want to see higher density where we can. In particular, that usually means flats, slightly higher buildings and everything else. What this is showing us, in all categories, flats are not going to be viable in the slightest. So I'm trying to put a round peg in a square hole. And should we be looking at some other way of dicing up that viability to encourage what we need, higher density flats, in some of these larger developments? Now, it's an open question, I haven't got the answer, but I still believe we should be trying to up the density, which means we're going to have to take a cut somewhere else. But I just don't know.
I think it's going to be difficult to get to a position where that sort of flats, or shall we say higher density living, is viable in much of the districts, if I'm honest, because of the nature of demand in the area, the types of homes that the market is demanding. As we've already said before, when we had a discussion about a policy about housing mix and housing types, the local housing need evidence is predominantly for 3 and 4 bedroom homes. So as much as we might want to change that and move to high densities, it's difficult to push against what there's a need for and what the market wants to deliver. I think where there are opportunities to do things more about high density living is in the second new community, and I think there's probably a piece of work that we need help from consultants in about how do we create a place where there is demand and need for those types of developments. And it's not necessarily flats. There are some quite interesting models around high density living where you have sort of one bedroom houses even that have outdoor spaces and things and aren't encumbered in the same way by estate rent charges and things which do tend to put people off apartments a bit these days and communal living. So we need to look at that in terms of the form of the new community in particular, I think, and how certainly around the town centre we can create that higher density of living and create it in an environment that's attractive to people and to the market to deliver. But I think that's the only place where there will really be those opportunities, and we need to do some further work on that as we move forward through the master planning and work on developing the new community. And we probably need some advice from consultants about how we go about doing that. But I did pick this up with the consultants at the briefing, and one of the things they said is, this isn't an East Devon specific issue. Even in Exeter, I think the demand for apartments, other than in key locations such as along the river and right in the city centre, the demand just isn't there. There's very much the demand is for houses, and that's the market at the moment. But we have an opportunity with a new community to create a new market, a different market, and we need to shape that in terms of the place that we're planning for.
Councillor Hayward, before I make a proposal.
Perhaps an observation first, given again where my ward is so prominently mentioned and specified within this. It's just the paradox of, people want less of the green fields which aren't protected around Axminster built on. So the answer then is to have higher density. This report from a consultant says that those high densities aren't viable unless you give a little bit and you have less affordable housing. Well, we're already seeing Axminster at the lower end compared to everywhere else of what affordables can be delivered. And actually, affordables is what's needed because Axminster is in an oasis of deprivation. We were targeted as by Devon as one of the most deprived areas in East Devon with the lowest salaries and the highest need. And yet the paradox is you can't deliver what's needed because it's not viable. And therefore you need to deliver less affordables or change the tenure mix. But actually the tenure mix hasn't worked because they're not affordable because of low salaries. And like Councillor Howe says, I don't know how we dig ourselves out of this conundrum, especially in Axminster. It's elsewhere in the district, it's all across the district, but particularly here, because to do one thing actually causes another problem. To solve that problem takes you right back to square one. Well, the answer is just build on more green fields. Now, I suppose if you are in need of a dwelling and a home at cheaper rents, more affordable rents, actually, your argument is, I don't care on how many fields you build on, just get me a home. Why can't we come back to this thing? Why isn't East Devon building the homes? CPO the field, you build it. But if developers can't build out flats and apartments, we certainly can't. We don't have the powers to, we don't have the money to, we don't have the expertise, the bricks, the labour to do it. So it's just an observation, and I'm grateful to officers and the consultant for bringing all this, encapsulating this in this report, because it's not, it's very depressing reading. I don't know how we solve it, because it seems to be an intractable problem without a solution currently. So again, I'm grateful, Chair, but I don't really have a proposal other than to just note what the work that's being done and ask us all to keep battling away and try and solve it. Thank you.
I think the answer, as you quite rightly say, Councillor Hayward, is probably public sector intervention. So maybe we need to look at what that looks like. But that's a broader issue for the council to be looking at as a whole, rather than necessarily us to look at today. I was extremely frustrated when I sat in the meeting at which the results of this were presented, as Ed will testify. Like I said earlier, I really don't like this. I think the increased focus on social rent is a big win and really important. I don't like the way that the lower percentage looks. Do I think it'll really change anything on the ground? No, probably not. I think our average affordable housing percentage has been 23% over this plan period, hasn't it, Ed?
Yes, it was about that, which I understand is above the national average.
Yes, yeah, that's why I'm about to make a proposal, Councillor Ingham. So I don't like it, but I don't think we have much of a choice if that 65% social rent is what we want, and I think we're very clear that it is. So I'm going to propose the recommendations as they're set out, with regret. Any further comments? Okay, all those in favour? 5, those against, 1, and that'll be no abstentions. So that brings us to the end of item 8. Officers, how are we handling the remainder of this agenda? Because we're about to become inquirate, so we can't continue.
I think all you can do, Chair, is defer the rest of the agenda, and we'll have to set up a further meeting as soon as possible. The next meeting's not till the 11th of December. It's an option. I would suggest you leave it with us.
I think
we'll look at those.
The answer is, are we going to be doing it as a continuation of this meeting or as a new meeting?
It needs to be a continuation.
I'd do it as a continuation.
As a continuation, okay. Can I just say we'll adjourn and resume at a later date that's left undetermined? Can we do the 29th? Is everybody happy?
Was that next Friday?
That's next Friday.
That's okay with me.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. So
Next
we'll
Friday.
adjourn the remainder of the agenda to be considered from 10 o'clock next Friday.